The marble floors of the federal courthouse held the chill of midnight, and the slow squeak of a janitor's mop echoed through the empty corridor like a metronome counting down forgotten hours. Daniel Mercer moved the mop in careful, even strokes across the polished floor outside Courtroom 3. The fluorescent lights above hummed faintly. Their pale reflection trembled in the thin film of water he left behind. Most men rushed through work like this. Daniel never did. His hands were steady. His movements patient. Each pass of the mop followed the last with quiet precision, as if the floor itself were something worthy of respect. On the wall beside him hung a bronze plaque listing the names of federal judges who had served in the building over the past 80 years. Daniel glanced at it the way some men glanced at old photographs. There had been a time when his nights here would have meant something very different. But that was a long time ago. Down the hallway, the heavy double doors of the courthouse groaned as a group of late-night visitors entered. Their voices carried easily across the marble corridors, sharp, confident, impatient. Lawyers. Daniel didn't look up immediately. He wrung the mop gently inside the yellow bucket and continued his slow rhythm. But he listened. He always listened. The group stopped near the conference room just beyond Courtroom 3. The glass door reflected the overhead lights like a mirror as they stepped inside. Their voices lowered, but the courthouse carried sound in peculiar ways. Words drifted through the narrow hallway like smoke. Every defense firm in the city has already refused him. That's what happens when federal indictments stack up like this. And the SEC investigation hasn't even started yet. Daniel's mop slowed. The name came next. Victor Langford. Even Daniel knew that one. Langford was the kind of billionaire whose face appeared on financial news every morning beside graphs and speculation. Founder of Langford Dynamics. Technology empire. Venture capitalist. Political donor. And now a defendant in what newspapers were calling the largest corporate fraud investigation in the country. Inside the conference room, chairs scraped against polished wood. Someone sighed heavily. There's no defense strategy left, one lawyer muttered. The prosecution has wire transfers, insider trading records, shell companies in 3 countries. Even if we delay the trial, the jury will eat him alive. Another voice spoke, older, confident. Our only option is procedural disruption. Challenge the admissibility of the offshore records. That won't hold, someone replied. The precedent from the Rothwell appeal destroyed that argument. Daniel's mop stopped moving. For a moment he stared down at the thin waterline spreading across the marble. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he spoke. The Rothwell precedent only applies if the financial transfers originate within U.S. jurisdiction. His voice was quiet. Calm. Almost conversational. Inside the conference room, the voices stopped. The silence drifted through the glass like a held breath. Daniel gently pushed the mop forward again. If the transfers were routed through a third-party holding company first, he continued softly, then the admissibility argument changes. It becomes a jurisdictional challenge instead of an evidentiary one. Another silence. Longer this time. The door opened. 5 men stepped into the hallway, their expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor. Their suits were immaculate. Tailored. Dark fabric that caught the fluorescent light like polished armor. At the center of them stood Victor Langford. Up close, the billionaire looked exactly the way the news described him. Tall, composed, the faint impatience of a man used to rooms bending to his presence. His eyes moved slowly from Daniel's mop bucket to Daniel himself. The silence stretched. Then one of the attorneys laughed. A short, incredulous sound. Well, he said, adjusting his cufflinks. Apparently the janitorial staff has started offering legal consultations. A few of the others smiled. Daniel lowered the mop into the bucket and squeezed the handle. Water dripped softly back into the pail. I was only making an observation, he said. Langford studied him with cool amusement. You were eavesdropping, the billionaire corrected. Daniel didn't argue. Another lawyer stepped forward. Tell me something, he said with a smirk. Which law school teaches constitutional litigation between mopping sessions? More laughter. The sound echoed harshly in the empty hallway. Daniel said nothing. He simply straightened slightly, one hand resting calmly on the mop handle. Langford took a slow step closer. Up close, the billionaire smelled faintly of expensive cologne and cold night air. You think you understand federal law? Langford asked. His tone was light, almost friendly, which somehow made the question sharper. Daniel met his gaze for only a moment. Then he looked back down at the floor. No, sir, he said quietly. I clean floors. Another ripple of laughter moved through the group. Langford smiled thinly. Good, he said. He gestured toward the wet marble beneath Daniel's feet. Then focus on that. The lawyers turned away, still chuckling as they returned to the conference room. The door closed. Their voices resumed inside. Daniel stood alone in the hallway again. For a few seconds he didn't move. Then he reached down, wrung out the mop, and resumed working. The steady squeak of rubber against marble returned to the quiet corridor. But his eyes were distant now. Somewhere far beyond the courthouse walls. Because the truth was something none of those men could have imagined. 15 years earlier, Daniel Mercer had stood in a courtroom very much like this one, wearing a suit instead of a janitor's uniform. And he had won a case so complex that law schools still taught it. The victory had made headlines across the country. It had also ended his career. Daniel pushed the mop slowly toward the far end of the hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered once overhead. From the conference room, Victor Langford's voice rose sharply. Then find me someone who can actually win this case. Daniel paused for just a moment. Not long enough for anyone to notice. Then he continued mopping the floor. But behind his calm expression, a single quiet thought passed through his mind. If they knew who he used to be, they would not be laughing. Morning light spilled through the tall courthouse windows, cutting long rectangles of pale gold across the polished floors, while the faint scent of fresh coffee drifted through the crowded lobby. Daniel Mercer stood beside his janitor's cart near the security checkpoint, replacing a stack of folded paper towels inside the metal dispenser. The courthouse was awake now, alive with footsteps, rustling case files, and the constant murmur of legal arguments forming in hushed conversations. Men and women in tailored suits moved through the halls with focused urgency. To them, Daniel was invisible. A uniform. A background detail. He preferred it that way. His dark blue maintenance shirt was neatly pressed, the sleeves rolled once at the wrist. The plastic name tag clipped to his chest read simply, D. Mercer. Most people never read it. A pair of young associates hurried past him toward courtroom 3, whispering nervously. The judge moved the Langford hearing up, one of them said. Emergency procedural motion. Daniel didn't react outwardly. But the name registered immediately. Victor Langford. The billionaire had returned. Daniel finished refilling the dispenser, and quietly pushed his cart down the hallway. The wheels rolled softly over the marble. Courtroom 3 was already filling when he arrived. Clerks moved quickly between rows of polished wooden benches, stacking documents and adjusting microphones. The faint scent of old paper and varnished oak lingered in the air. Daniel parked his cart against the wall near the rear doors. Technically, janitors weren't supposed to remain inside during hearings. But no one usually noticed if he stayed near the back. The judge entered. Everyone rose. Be seated, the judge said calmly. Chairs creaked as the room settled. Victor Langford sat at the defense table, his expression controlled but tight around the edges. The confident ease he carried the night before had thinned slightly. Beside him sat 2 attorneys. Not the same ones from the previous night. These looked younger. Less certain. Stacks of legal documents covered their table like scattered shields. Across the room, the prosecution team sat in composed silence. The hearing began. One of Langford's lawyers stood and cleared his throat. Your Honor, the defense requests suppression of several financial documents submitted by the prosecution, on the basis that they originate from offshore accounts outside U.S. jurisdiction. The prosecutor stood immediately. Your Honor, those documents are admissible under the Rothwell precedent. A quiet ripple moved through the courtroom. Daniel leaned lightly against the back wall. His arms were folded loosely. He listened. The defense attorney began explaining his argument, but his words grew tangled as the judge interrupted with questions. What specific jurisdictional exception are you invoking? The lawyer hesitated. Papers shuffled nervously. Well, the defense believes that. You believe? The judge repeated evenly. A pause stretched across the courtroom. The attorney's voice faltered. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. It was the same mistake from last night. The same misunderstanding of the Rothwell ruling. And the judge was losing patience. The defense lawyer sat down, clearly flustered. Langford leaned toward him, whispering something sharp. The prosecutor rose again. Your Honor, unless the defense can cite an applicable procedural distinction, the Rothwell precedent stands. The judge adjusted his glasses. Yes, he said. That is my understanding as well. Silence settled over the defense table. A dangerous silence. Victor Langford's jaw tightened. From the back of the room, Daniel exhaled quietly. Then he spoke. Not loudly. Just clearly enough. The Rothwell precedent only applies when the originating transfer occurred within a U.S. financial institution. Heads turned instantly. The words drifted through the courtroom like a pebble dropped into still water. The judge looked up. Langford turned slowly in his chair. Daniel stepped forward from the back wall. His janitor's cart remained behind him near the doors. The transfers in question, Daniel continued calmly, were routed through a Cayman holding company first. That creates a jurisdictional break before the funds entered U.S. markets. A stunned silence spread across the room. The prosecutor frowned. The defense attorneys stared. Daniel continued in the same steady voice. If the defense argues that the Cayman intermediary was an independent financial entity, then Rothwell no longer applies directly. The judge leaned forward slightly. And who? The judge asked slowly. Are you? Daniel stopped 2 steps from the back row of benches. Daniel Mercer, sir. And your role here? Daniel gestured gently toward the cart behind him. I maintain the building. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge studied him. You appear to be offering legal interpretation. Daniel's voice remained calm. I apologize if I overstepped. He paused. Then added softly. But the procedural distinction is valid. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rustling papers stopped. The judge turned to the defense attorneys. Is this accurate? Neither of them spoke immediately. One flipped rapidly through a casebook. Then his eyes widened. Your Honor, the intermediary jurisdiction issue is technically correct. Across the room, the prosecutor's confident posture shifted. The judge leaned back slowly. Interesting. Victor Langford stared at Daniel now with an entirely different expression. Not amusement. Not mockery. Curiosity. The dangerous kind. Daniel gave a small nod to the judge. Then he turned and walked calmly back toward the rear of the courtroom. No theatrics. No explanation. He simply picked up his cart and pushed it quietly through the exit doors. Behind him, the courtroom remained silent for several seconds. Finally, the judge spoke again. Well, he said, adjusting his glasses. It appears the defense has been given a very useful suggestion. Victor Langford didn't respond. He was still staring at the empty doorway where the janitor had disappeared. Because in that single quiet moment, something impossible had happened. The man everyone had laughed at the night before had just saved his case. And Victor Langford realized something unsettling. The janitor understood the law better than his own legal team. Which left only one question echoing in his mind. Who was Daniel Mercer, really? Cold rain tapped softly against the courthouse windows that evening, each drop sliding down the glass like a quiet countdown as the building slowly emptied of voices. Daniel Mercer stood alone in the records hallway, replacing a burned-out light bulb above a row of metal filing cabinets. The ladder creaked slightly under his weight. The dim yellow light flickered once, then steadied. Another small problem solved. He climbed down carefully and folded the ladder beside his cart. The courthouse after hours had a different rhythm than it did during the day. The sharp authority of lawyers and judges was gone. What remained were echoes, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, the distant whir of ventilation, the smell of cleaning chemicals settling into the polished stone floors. Daniel preferred the quiet. It gave a man room to think. And lately, thinking had become dangerous. The courtroom scene from earlier replayed in his mind with uncomfortable clarity. The surprised faces. The judge's curious stare. Langford's eyes. Daniel had broken one of his own rules. Stay invisible. Finish the shift. Go home to Lily. But something about the attorney's fumbling argument had triggered an instinct he had spent 15 years trying to bury. The instinct to correct. The instinct to fight bad law. He pushed the ladder against the wall and began wiping down the metal cabinets. Behind him, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Slow. Deliberate. Daniel didn't turn right away. He already knew who it was. Mr. Mercer. The voice carried the quiet authority of a man used to being obeyed. Daniel set the cleaning cloth down before turning. Victor Langford stood at the end of the hallway, his tailored coat still damp from the rain outside. The overhead lights reflected faintly in the polished leather of his shoes. He had come alone. That alone said something. Daniel folded his hands calmly in front of him. Evening, sir. Langford walked closer, his gaze studying Daniel the way a chess player studies an unfamiliar piece on the board. You embarrassed my attorneys today. Daniel shook his head slightly. That wasn't my intention. But it was the result. Langford stopped a few feet away. The hallway lights hummed faintly overhead. For a moment neither man spoke. Then Langford said quietly, You cited Rothwell and jurisdictional separation without hesitation. Daniel didn't respond. Langford's eyes narrowed slightly. Janitors don't usually quote appellate rulings. Daniel's voice remained even. I read sometimes. Langford almost smiled. Do you also read Cayman financial law in your spare time? Silence settled between them. The rain continued tapping softly against the courthouse windows. Finally Daniel spoke. Is there something you need, Mr. Langford? Langford tilted his head slightly. Yes. A beat passed. I need someone who understands what is happening to me. Daniel's expression didn't change. Langford stepped closer. My legal team is incompetent, he continued quietly. Every major firm in the city refused this case before I could even hire them. And the ones who didn't refuse it are already losing. Daniel said nothing. Langford studied him. You, on the other hand, understood the entire argument in 30 seconds. Daniel's eyes moved briefly toward the floor. I made an observation. You saved my defense. Daniel didn't answer that either. Langford exhaled slowly. I want you to review the case files. The words hung in the air. Daniel looked up. No. Langford blinked once. You didn't let me finish. I heard enough. Langford's voice cooled slightly. You're refusing before hearing the offer? Daniel met his gaze calmly. I'm a janitor. That's a job description, Langford said. Not a limitation. Daniel's expression remained still. Langford lowered his voice. I'll pay you more in a week than you earn here in 5 years. Daniel didn't move. Money isn't the issue. Langford studied him again, more carefully this time. What is the issue? For a moment Daniel seemed about to answer. But instead he simply said, I go home at 6 in the morning. Langford frowned slightly. To what? The question came out sharper than intended. Daniel hesitated. Then he said quietly, My daughter. The tension in the hallway shifted. Langford's voice softened just a fraction. How old? 10. Another silence passed. Langford looked at the janitor's cart, the folded ladder, the worn cleaning gloves resting beside a bottle of disinfectant. Then he said something unexpected. Before today, have you ever argued a case in court? Daniel didn't answer. Langford watched him closely. That wasn't the voice of a janitor, he said. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. The past was a door he had spent years keeping closed. Langford waited. Finally, Daniel spoke. 15 years ago, he said quietly, I argued a constitutional appeal in this building. Langford's eyes widened slightly. Daniel continued. The case overturned a corporate immunity ruling that several major law firms had spent years defending. Langford blinked once. And after that? Daniel picked up the cleaning cloth again. After that, my career ended. Langford's voice sharpened. Why? Daniel wiped the metal cabinet slowly. Because I refuse to protect the same kind of men you are. But he didn't say that. Instead, he said only, some victories are expensive. Langford stared at him. The hallway grew quiet again. Finally, the billionaire spoke. You're not just a janitor. Daniel didn't look up. And you're not just a victim in this case. Daniel replied calmly. That stopped Langford cold. For the first time, uncertainty crossed the billionaire's face. Daniel folded the cloth neatly and placed it back on the cart. Then he looked directly at Langford. If you want my advice, he said quietly, find a better lawyer. Langford studied him for a long moment. Then he said something that made the air in the hallway feel suddenly heavier. You're already involved, Mr. Mercer. Daniel frowned slightly. Langford's voice dropped. The prosecution subpoenaed financial records today. Daniel's hands stopped moving. Langford watched his reaction carefully. Records connected to the firm that represented your famous appeal. The silence that followed felt like a crack opening in the past. Langford leaned closer. And if those records come out in court? He paused. Your quiet life may not stay quiet. Daniel slowly lifted his eyes. The rain against the windows sounded louder now. Because suddenly the past he had buried 15 years ago was coming back. And this time, it might take everything with it. The courtroom air felt colder than usual that morning, the kind of cold that settled quietly beneath polished wood benches and lingered in the stillness before something important broke. Daniel Mercer stood outside the courthouse security entrance, his janitor's cart parked beside the metal detector. The wheels were locked. The bucket was empty. He wasn't working. Not today. 2 uniformed courthouse security officers stood beside him, their expressions polite but firm. Mr. Mercer, one of them said gently, your maintenance access has been temporarily suspended. The words were formal. Practiced. Daniel nodded slowly. I understand. Inside the lobby, people were gathering for the day's hearing in Victor Langford's case. Lawyers moved past the glass doors in dark suits, clutching folders thick with documents. No one looked at Daniel. But a few of them knew. The rumor had already spread through the legal community overnight. A courthouse janitor had been secretly advising a billionaire's defense team. Unauthorized legal interference. Professional misconduct. Fraud. The accusations had multiplied quickly. Langford's attorneys had made sure of that. Daniel had been useful when they were desperate. Now he was a liability. The security officer handed him a folded document. Administrative review notice, the officer explained quietly. Daniel accepted it without argument. Through the courthouse windows, he could see the courtroom filling. The hearing was starting. Without him. He turned and stepped back onto the courthouse steps. Cold wind brushed across the stone plaza outside. The morning sky was gray with low clouds, threatening rain. Daniel stood there for a moment, holding the folded paper. 15 years ago, he had walked out of another courthouse under circumstances that felt very similar. The same quiet dismissal. The same silent judgment. Except this time, something else was at stake. Lily. Her school tuition. Their small apartment. Everything he had rebuilt after the last fall. Daniel exhaled slowly. For a moment it seemed possible that Victor Langford had won after all. Inside courtroom 3, the atmosphere was electric. The judge entered. Everyone rose. Victor Langford sat at the defense table, his expression carefully composed. His attorneys whispered among themselves, their confidence returned now that the troublesome janitor had been removed. Across the room, the prosecution team looked unusually calm. The lead prosecutor, Emily Carter, organized a stack of files with slow, deliberate movements. When the judge signaled for the hearing to begin, Carter stood. "Your Honor," she said clearly, "before addressing the defense's procedural motions, the prosecution would like to introduce new financial evidence related to the defendant's offshore transfers." Langford's attorney frowned. "What evidence?" Carter slid a folder across the clerk's desk. "Internal correspondence and shell company records that reveal the true purpose of the Cayman intermediary." A murmur spread across the courtroom. Langford leaned forward. "What purpose?" his attorney demanded. Carter's voice remained steady. "Market manipulation." The room went still. "Specifically," she continued, "the Cayman Holding Company was used to disguise coordinated stock movements that allowed Langford Dynamics to artificially inflate share prices." Langford's jaw tightened. His attorney stood quickly. "Your Honor, we object. These allegations are speculative." Carter raised an eyebrow. "Not speculative." She lifted a document. "Documented." The judge studied the file carefully. "And where exactly did this information originate?" he asked. Carter hesitated. Then she said something that made several heads turn in confusion. "A courthouse janitor." The room erupted in whispers. Langford's attorneys exchanged stunned looks. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Explain." Carter's voice remained calm. "Daniel Mercer contacted our office late last night. He provided documentation proving that the Cayman intermediary was controlled directly by Mr. Langford." Langford's face drained of color. Because Daniel had done something Langford never expected. Instead of helping him win the case, Daniel had followed the evidence. And the evidence had led somewhere far darker than the charges already filed. Langford stood suddenly. "That man had no legal authority to access those documents." Carter met his gaze. "He didn't need authority." She held up another folder. "Mr. Mercer recognized the shell company structure because he encountered the same financial pattern 15 years ago." The judge looked up. 15 years ago?" Carter nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." She turned toward the courtroom doors. "And he is here today to explain." At that moment, the heavy wooden doors opened. Daniel Mercer stepped inside. No janitor's cart. No cleaning gloves. Just a simple dark jacket and the calm posture of a man who had already lost everything once before. The courtroom fell silent. Victor Langford stared at him in disbelief. "You betrayed me," the billionaire said quietly. Daniel met his gaze without anger. "I followed the truth." The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Mercer," he said carefully, "the court has been informed that you previously argued a significant constitutional appeal." Daniel nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "And that appeal involved corporate financial immunity law?" "Yes." The judge studied him. "Why did you leave the legal profession?" Daniel hesitated for only a moment. Then he answered plainly. "Because the firm representing that corporation asked me to ignore evidence of market manipulation." The courtroom went still again. "I refuse," Daniel continued quietly. "They destroyed my career." The judge looked down at the documents again. "And you believe Mr. Langford was operating a similar scheme?" Daniel's voice remained steady. "I don't believe it." He gestured toward the evidence Carter had submitted. "I proved it." The silence that followed felt like gravity pulling the room downward. Victor Langford's carefully constructed defense was collapsing. Piece by piece. And every person in the courtroom knew exactly who had pulled the first thread. The janitor they had laughed at. Outside the courthouse windows, rain finally began to fall. The rain had stopped by the time the verdict was read, leaving the courthouse steps washed clean and shining beneath the pale light of late afternoon. Inside courtroom 3, the silence felt heavier than any storm. Victor Langford stood beside the defense table, his shoulders rigid, his expression frozen into the strained composure of a man who had spent his entire life believing consequences were something that happened to other people. The jurors filed back into the room. Their footsteps were soft against the worn carpet. Daniel Mercer sat quietly in the last row of the gallery. His hands rested loosely on his knees. His posture was calm, almost relaxed, though the muscles in his shoulders carried the memory of a long and difficult fight. Across the aisle, Emily Carter sat with the prosecution team, reviewing her notes one final time before the verdict was announced. No one spoke. The courtroom clock ticked softly above the judge's bench. When the jurors took their seats, the foreman handed the folded verdict sheet to the clerk. The clerk stood. Her voice was clear. On the charge of securities fraud and market manipulation. A breath seemed to pass through the entire room. We find the defendant guilty. The words landed quietly. But their weight filled every corner of the courtroom. Victor Langford did not move. For a moment he simply stared straight ahead, his mind struggling to reconcile the impossible reality unfolding in front of him. Billionaires were not supposed to lose. Not like this. The clerk continued reading the remaining counts. Each one carried the same answer. Guilty. By the time the judge dismissed the jury, Langford's empire had already begun collapsing outside the courthouse walls. News outlets were broadcasting the verdict within minutes. Stock markets reacted instantly. A company that had once dominated global headlines was now a symbol of corporate deceit. The judge removed his glasses and looked toward Daniel in the gallery. Mr. Mercer. Daniel stood. His shoes made a soft sound against the courtroom floor as he stepped forward. The judge regarded him carefully. This court has reviewed the documentation regarding your previous legal career. Daniel remained silent. The appeal you argued 15 years ago, the judge continued, remains one of the most cited constitutional rulings in modern corporate law. A quiet murmur moved through the courtroom. Many of the attorneys present were hearing this for the first time. The judge folded his hands. It appears the legal profession lost an extraordinary mind. Daniel's expression did not change. The judge continued. Several members of the State Bar Association have already contacted this court regarding your situation. He paused. They are prepared to reinstate your license. Another murmur spread through the room. A career restored. Prestige. Wealth. Recognition. Everything Daniel Mercer had lost 15 years ago was suddenly being offered back to him. The judge studied him carefully. You would have the opportunity to return to private practice immediately. Daniel thought about the long nights cleaning the courthouse floors. The quiet apartment he shared with Lily. The small kitchen table where she did her homework while he cooked dinner after his shift. 15 years earlier, ambition had filled every corner of his life. But life had taught him something that ambition never could. He spoke calmly. Your Honor. The room listened closely. I appreciate the offer. He paused. Then continued. But I would prefer a different path. The judge raised an eyebrow. What path is that? Daniel glanced briefly toward Emily Carter. Then he answered. Public defense. Several attorneys in the gallery exchanged surprised looks. Corporate law paid fortunes. Public defenders barely earned enough to cover student loans. But Daniel's voice carried quiet certainty. There are people in this building every day who cannot afford anyone to listen to them, he said. And sometimes, all they need is someone who refuses to look away. The judge studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. I believe the court system could use more people with that philosophy. The gavel struck once. Court is adjourned. Outside the courthouse, the evening sky had cleared. Soft, golden sunlight reflected off the wet pavement. Daniel stepped out onto the front steps just as the courthouse doors opened behind him. Reporters waited across the street, their cameras pointed toward the entrance where Victor Langford would soon be escorted out by federal marshals. But Daniel moved in the opposite direction. Down the wide stone steps. Away from the noise. A small figure waited near the iron fence at the edge of the plaza. Lily Mercer stood there in her school jacket, her dark hair tied back in a loose ponytail. She swung her backpack gently from one shoulder, scanning the courthouse doors with impatient curiosity. When she saw her father, her face lit up instantly. Dad! She ran toward him. Daniel crouched slightly as she reached him, catching her in a quick hug that lifted her briefly off the ground. You're late, she said, smiling. Big day at work. Daniel smiled softly. You could say that. She stepped back and looked up at him. Did you win? Daniel thought about the courtroom. About the verdict. About 15 years of silence finally ending. Then he nodded. Yes, he said quietly. I think we did. They began walking down the sidewalk together. The city moved around them in the ordinary rhythm of evening traffic and distant voices. No one on the street recognized the man who had just dismantled one of the most powerful figures in the country. And Daniel preferred it that way. Lily slipped her hand into his. Are you still going to work at the courthouse? She asked. Daniel looked down at her. The setting sun warmed the pavement beneath their feet. Yes, he said. But not with a mop. She grinned. Good. They continued walking toward home. And as the courthouse faded behind them, Daniel Mercer understood something that many powerful men never learned. Because dignity was never something given by titles, wealth, or reputation. It belonged to the quiet strength of a man who knew exactly who he was, and never forgot why he chose to stand.